This is a presidential lecture in our series called Reckoning with the Legacy of Steinhof. My name is Michael Ignatieff. I'm the rector and president of Central European University in Vienna. I want to welcome everybody from the CEU community, but I also want to welcome friends from Budapest, from Vienna, from other centers across Europe. We're delighted that you can join us. This is a presidential lecture series which I commissioned because, as everybody knows, CEU is going to occupy a portion of the Steinhof site in 2025, and architectural plans are already underway to develop the site, and we're consulting with all members of the community about how to use this extraordinary campus. The Steinhof campus is an extraordinary opportunity. It's an opportunity for a kind of rebirth of CEU, and we're excited to be there. But it comes with a very substantial historical legacy, and because we're a research-intensive university, we have to make a reckoning with that heritage, and we have to understand it. We have to understand what it means. It's not our heritage, it's a heritage of the 20th century, and it's a heritage that involves, on the one hand, the utopian vision of Otto Wagner for a new way to cope with and help people with psychiatric difficulties. So there's a utopian moment in 1907, which I think Leslie Topp is going to talk to us about later on in another lecture in this series. But there's also a very dark side, and we've had one memorable lecture already by Edith Schaeffer talking about the infernal, I think that's the word, experimentation on children that occurred at Spiegelgrund in the Nazi period. And tonight we're very lucky to have two distinguished scholars from Austria, Herwig Czech, who is a professor of the history of medicine at the Medical University of Vienna, and I'll ask Michael Miller to introduce him more fully in a minute, and Ina Friedmann. Part of our purpose in convening this group is to make CEU a kind of hub for renewed reflection across the academic community in the German-speaking world about the meaning of these events and the meaning of this heritage of Steinhof, which, as I say, combines utopian hope with utter darkness, with infernal darkness. And we need to reckon with all of that heritage, both good and bad, and be responsible stewards of it when we occupy the site after 2025. So that's why we're doing this, and I hope we will have a very good discussion. I want to tell you that this session is being recorded for later availability on our website. The basic plan of operation will be as last time. Professor Czech will speak for about 30 minutes. Ina Friedmann will have comments for about 10 minutes or so. Then I hope there'll be dialogue and discussion between them. And then Michael Miller will moderate a discussion, and you'll be able to use the chat window to put your questions, and he'll curate the questions. I should introduce Michael Miller briefly to those who don't know him. I've asked Michael, who's a distinguished historian of 19th century Jewish life in Central and Eastern Europe and is in our Nationalism Studies program at CEU. I asked him to lead a group of our best academics at CEU, a visioning group, to think about how we resurrect the tangled history of Steinhof, how we bring it into our community as a heritage that we have to own and take responsibility for, and how finally we can begin to create a program at CEU in which we think about some of the implications of this story. That is, this is a story about how we lost sight of the human in the 20th century, how we sunk into the inhuman in the 20th century. And in the 21st century, we want to understand all the temptations to slide back into the inhuman that must be resisted. So there's a lot at stake in this project. I've talked too long. I'm going to hand over immediately with my thanks to Michael Miller and welcome you all to this gathering. Michael, over to you.
Thank you, Michael, for introducing this lecture and also for organizing this presidential lecture series. Before I introduce tonight's lecture and tonight's lecturers, I also want to welcome all the members of the Visioning Committee, the Visioning Group, many of whom are on this Zoom call tonight. I also want to thank some other people who I see are in the audience right now, including Paul Weindling, who responded to Edith Scheffer at our first talk, Leslie Topp, who will be an architectural historian at Birkbeck College, who will be giving our next presidential lecture on May 5th. And the respondent will be Emma Lafferton. I also see that Mitchell Ash is here, who has met with the Visioning Group, and Sammy Teicher, who has worked a lot with the survivors of Spiegelgrund and Steinhof, who we're going to hear about more tonight. So this is also part of the goal of the Visioning Group in these presidential lectures, is to bring together this larger community of experts and stakeholders, not just at CEU, but also in Austria and internationally as well. Tonight's lecture, Nazi Medical Crimes at the Psychiatric Hospital Am Steinhof, will be delivered by one of the most important medical historians in Austria, who has really worked extensively on Steinhof, Spiegelgrund, and especially the problematic, and some might even say heinous, activities of Hans Asperger, who we know from the eponymous disease. Herwig Czech is a professor of history of medicine at the Medical University of Vienna. He is a co-director of a Max Planck funded research project, Brain Research, the Institutes of the Kaiser Wilhelm Society in the context of National Socialist crimes. The Kaiser Wilhelm Society is now the Max Planck Institute, so this may also explain the funding. He's also a member of a commission on medicine and the Holocaust, which was just set up this year by Lancet, the leading journal of medical studies. He's also a prolific author, many articles dealing with Spiegelgrund, dealing with medicine and biopolitics, especially in the National Socialist period, dealing with eugenics, race hygiene, public health, psychiatry, pediatrics, and neuropathology. His articles on Steinhof, and in particular on Asperger, have really influenced the way that we have thought about the questions of euthanasia and the murder of children in Nazi Germany and also in the Austrian parts during the period from the late 30s until 1945. He has written I'll mention some of his recent articles, From Scientific Exploitation to Individual Memorialization, Evolving Attitudes Towards Research on Nazi Victims' Bodies, The Medical University of Vienna and the Legacy of Perrenkopf's Anatomical Atlas, Hans Asperger, National Socialism and Race Hygiene in Nazi-era Vienna. He was also involved in setting up and curating the exhibition at Steinhof, and the catalog from this, The War Against the Inferior on the History of Nazi Medicine in Vienna, is on the screen right now. And this is an exhibition which is currently at Steinhof and was set up by the documentation archive for the Austrian resistance, DÖV, which has been very involved also in documenting the history of Spiegelgrund and Steinhof. Our respondent is Ina Friedmann, who has just finished her PhD at the University of Vienna, so congratulations. The PhD topic, as you can see, is directly relevant to what we're going to be talking about tonight, The title was Ward for Therapeutic Pedagogy at the Vienna University Children's Clinic between 1911 and 1949. She is currently a researcher at the Wissenschaftsbüro in Innsbruck, which is connected to the University of Innsbruck. And there she's working on in a project that deals with the housing of foreigners in confessional homes in Tyrol after 1945. As all of you know who have been at these lectures before, or who were at the film screening of the film Spiegelgrund a few weeks ago, you know that it has now become a tradition or a ritual, not only to introduce the lecturers, but also to introduce someone who cannot be with us tonight. And I'm going to introduce someone named Siegfried Wimmer, who was born on January 19th, 1943 in Upper Austria in a town called Grieskirchen, along with a twin sibling. On March 23rd, 1944, Siegfried was admitted to Spiegelgrund, an area of Steinhof. Pavilion 15, which we'll hear more about probably from Professor Czech. And he was examined by two doctors, Marianne Turk and Ernst Illing. In the admissions log, when he was admitted on March 23rd, he is diagnosed with idiocy with blindness, Idiotie mit Blindheit. And then a couple of days later, about a week later, an additional report. It says, mit Sicherheit dauernd vollständig bildungsunfähig und pflegebedürftig. Roughly translated as, with certainty, he is completely and permanently ineducable and in need of care. And the kind of care that he was given at Spiegelgrund in 1944 was the kind of care that led to bronchitis and high fever just a few days or a few weeks later, and to death by pneumonia, or something that was called pneumonia, on April 22nd, 1944. Siegfried Wimmer was 1 year and 3 months old. He probably did not die of pneumonia like most of the between 700 and 800 victims, children victims at Spiegelgrund. He died of an injection that led to his death. This was what was called children euthanasia euphemistically. I don't have a picture of Siegmund Wimmer. I only have pictures of his tormentors. You can see Dr. Marianne Turk in the middle, and you can see Dr. Ernst Illing on the right. This is at their trial in 1946 here in Austria. And the title you can see here says, "The Child Murderers from Steinhof," on the prosecution bench. I don't have a picture of Siegfried Wimmer, but there is a memorial at Steinhof today with lights here, 789 of them, one for each of the victims of Spiegelgrund. We're going to hear tonight not only about the 789 victims at Spiegelgrund, but Professor Czech, I believe, will be talking also about the crimes of the Nazis at the entire Steinhof hospital in this period, and not just at the children's clinic. And I would like to now welcome Professor Czech, who will speak now about Nazi medical crimes at the Psychiatric Hospital am Steinhof.
Yeah, hello and good evening to everyone. Many thanks, Michael Miller, for this very kind introduction. And I would also like to expressly thank Rector Ignatieff for the invitation, for setting this up, and for allowing me to speak on this difficult topic here today. See how this. So I will just jump right into the topic. The history of Steinhof, as we've already heard, starts in 1907. This is the opening ceremony, and we have in attendance, among other people, the governor of Lower Austria. We have Vienna's mayor, Karl Lueger, and we also have the heir to the throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, an indication of the importance that was attributed to this building project. It was intended to be really a model institution of psychiatric care, a veritable garden city for the mentally ill. And I think it is this original inspiration as an ideal city outside the metropolis, what it also makes it so well suited as a university campus. These ideas share some common ancestors, so to speak. This is the main building near the entrance, the front entrance. It's the most representative structure of Steinhof and also of CEU's future core campus. Here we have an aerial view of the premises. This dates from the 1930s, and it is centered on Otto Wagner's magnificent church. Let's have a quick look at the layout of the area. We have pavilions 1 to 24. So this is the core psychiatric hospital. Then we have pavilions 25 to 34 in the western part, which served as a sanatorium for patients with pulmonary disease. And in 1940, the pavilions with unequal numbers from 1 to 17 became a separate entity known as the Spiegelgrund. This is marked here in this red lines. It's also something you probably know already. I also would like to point out specifically Pavilion 23 here in the eastern area. In 1941, this became a so-called workhouse for asocial women and girls, also a specific Nazi institution. These changes are, of course, linked to Austria's annexation by Nazi Germany in March 1938, commonly known as the Anschluss. And here we have one iconic photo of one aspect of what these events meant for the medical field and for medical institutions in Vienna. This is the inaugural speech by Eduard Pernkopf, the new dean appointed by the Nazis to the medical faculty. He's dressed as a stormtrooper. This is not that easy to recognize. Standing under a portrait of Adolf Hitler, surrounded by other men in uniform. They all have their hands raised in the Hitler salute. Any pretense of a separation between science and politics is here clearly gone. In Vienna alone, over 3,000 physicians were expelled from their profession and had to run for their lives. The most famous case of this is, of course, Sigmund Freud, who remains one of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century. Here we see him in an also famous photograph of his daughter, Anna Freud, in Paris on their way into exile to London. As an immediate result of the Anschluss, Austria's medical institutions were thoroughly Nazified. Here we have a typical example of a political gathering at the Viennese hospital in October 1939. Medicine, and this is one face of it, the propaganda face of it, so to speak. Medicine was to become the main instrument to improve the quality of the biological stock of the nation. And at the same time, race hygiene defines certain elements of society as a danger to the health of this people's community. This resulted in a veritable propaganda war that was waged against patients in psychiatric institutions. They were denounced as useless eaters, as life unworthy of living, or as in the title of this propaganda film, this is a still from this film, as life without hope. Here's another example still published in the Nazi Party's main newspaper in December 1938, the Völkischer Beobachter. And the goal of this article was to prepare the public for the introduction of forced sterilizations in Austria. The photographs were clearly intended to present people, psychiatric patients, people with mental illness or disability as repulsive and subhuman. They show patients at Steinhof, and they were taken in late 1938 by Heinrich Hoffmann, Adolf Hitler's personal and favorite photographer, who had his own studio in Vienna. And despite their character as a propaganda weapon, the photos from this series, which remain at the DÖW, are still extraordinary documents, also when it comes to the history of Steinhof at this time. Here we see a warded Steinhof in one of the men's pavilions. We can also see that there were many children among the Steinhof patients in 1938. Here's a children's ward. This is about 18 months before the Spiegelgrund institution was founded. In 1939, with the war imminent, the Nazi regime set in motion what has become to be known as Action T4, the mass murder of psychiatric patients by poison gas. It was named after the address of its secret headquarters at Tiergartenstraße 4 in Berlin. And here you see the villa, the building that was used as its headquarters. So from spring 1940, psychiatric patients were killed by the thousands in special killing centers, such as Hartheim Castle in Upper Austria. During the first phase of T4, ending in August 1941, approximately 18,000 people were killed at the site. So this is Hartheim alone. From Steinhof, which was Austria's largest psychiatric hospital, around 3,200 people were deported to Hartheim and killed in its gas chamber. And I would also like to point out that the photo on the left is a very special document. It was taken in secret in 1940 by a member of the anti-Nazi resistance, Karl Schumann, who lived with his family right next door in this little village that is Alkoven. And you can see the smoke rising from the crematorium. Karl Schumann took great risks in taking this picture. The extermination process that ended in the gas chamber at Hartheim started as a bureaucratically organized process. One of the main instruments of this were registry forms, such as this one. And it basically proceeded by obliging all mental institutions to report their patients to the Reich Ministry of the Interior, which then forwarded the forms to the secret euthanasia organization. In the bottom left corner of this document, you can see the annotations of the so-called experts, physicians, whose only task in this context was to decide who should be sent to the gas chambers. So basically, they were only selecting the victims. And you see in this left corner the markings of these experts with a plus sign indicating that the patient should be killed. One patient for whom such a form was filled out was Marie Mattis. Marie Mattis was born in 1902 in Vienna. She worked in a communal kitchen. On the right top side, you can see her with her workmates in this context. And after that, she worked as a maid. She had two children who were raised by foster parents. In 1935, she suffered an accident. She fell from a window and she became paralyzed from the hips down. She was no longer able to sit, stand, or walk. So she was taken to Steinhof. And in 1940, and this is also quite extraordinary, her daughter Käthe received a message from a physician there that she should go to Steinhof and visit her mother one last time. And during this visit, Marie already appeared very confused, which her daughter attributed to sedatives or tranquilizers. And on 29 July 1940, Marie was transferred together with more than 300 other Steinhof patients to Hartheim and was murdered there. Steinhof, and this is also an important element, also played an important role in the extermination of Jewish patients. The hospital was used to concentrate Jewish inmates of psychiatric hospitals from all over Austria, thus facilitating their selection and later deportation. At least 400 Jewish patients were deported from Steinhof to Hartheim and killed under the T4 program, which means that they figured among the first victims of the Holocaust. There were some Jewish patients who managed to escape the T4 selections, only to later be killed in the Holocaust. And this was, for example, the case of Margarete Neumann, the daughter of Theodor Herzl. Margarete had been a patient in a private sanatorium in Vienna for many years before being transferred to Steinhof in March 1941. This was at the point in time when most of the T4 deportations from Steinhof had already taken place. So she survived these deportations, but in September 1942, she was released to the Sicherheitspolizei and deported with her husband to Theresienstadt, where she died less than a year later. The T4 bureaucrats kept meticulous notes of the expenses that were saved by the extermination program, thus pointing to another set of motives for this for this program. Here we see an excerpt from the infamous Hartheim statistics, a booklet, a collection of such statistics discovered in Hartheim by US soldiers upon liberation, where all the expenses saved basically in terms of foodstuff, of medical staff that was not needed anymore, and here in terms of money were calculated. Euthanasia killings were intended to be a secret, but they became an open secret with rumors abounding in all of Germany. And I was going to say even, but also the Air Force, the Royal Air Force, got wind of it and dropped these leaflets over Vienna in the fall of 1941. This leaflet, it's a bit small, mentions poison killings, killings with poison at Steinhof, and even names the doctor allegedly responsible for these killings. And I read you the translation of this, an extract. The man with the syringe, der Herr mit der Spritze. The corridors of Steinhof, the Viennese asylum, are haunted by Dr. Jekelius in a white doctor's coat and carrying his syringe. It does not bring new life to the sick, but death. The syringe contains poison that does its work within a few hours. He uses it often. End of quote. Erwin Jekelius was indeed the main responsible for the euthanasia crimes in the Vienna region in two functions. On the one hand, he was the coordinator for the deportations to Hartheim, and on the other hand, he was the founding director of the Spiegelgrund institution. The Spiegelgrund was established in the early summer of 1940 after the majority of Steinhof patients had been killed in T4, which meant that many of the pavilions were left empty or unoccupied. And thus the facility, the Spiegelgrund, was designed to become a permanent part of the city's child and youth care system in order to eliminate children who were regarded as worthless because of mental retardation, disability, or malformations. And subsequently, children were transferred from various institutions in order to be examined, observed, sometimes over longer periods of time, and often killed. One very important case, and in the meantime also well known, is that of Hertha Schreiber, because her transferal note, as you can see here was signed by Hans Asperger, one of the first describers of autism and the namesake, of course, of Asperger's syndrome. But there were many others. Over the period of its existence, from 1940 to 1945, nearly 800 children died in the institution, many of them as a result of poisoning with drug overdoses. Anna Hofer. She was born in April 1940 in Linz. From May 1940, she was at the Home for Infants in her home province, and the Reich governor, or his office, had her committed to Spiegelgrund in 1942. And that's where she died in January 1943. What we can see also on the left side is that her body was preserved for scientific purposes. This is an aspect I will get back to in a minute. The child euthanasia program overall was intertwined with scientific interests. One important example for this, specifically in Vienna, but also in other locations, is the testing of a tuberculosis vaccine at the University Pediatric Clinics, not at the Spiegelgrund, but this was a cooperation with the university. The test subjects, several children, again with mental disabilities, they were provided from the Spiegelgrund, sent to the university clinic, and after the experiments, the children were returned to the Spiegelgrund in order to be killed and dissected. And the results of these experiments, they were publicly discussed on several occasions by the Viennese pediatric community. They were also published in two papers in 1942 and 1944, the first of which you can see here. One feature of the killings at the Spiegelgrund is that the victims are very well documented overall. And one reason for this is that we have the complete death registry shown here as an excerpt. So this is 2 pages, and in total it lists 789 names. The patients from the remaining psychiatric pavilions are in principle also well documented. Case files, they still exist. But it is often difficult to decide who of them died as a victim of euthanasia. And the reason for this difficulty lies in the fact that the so-called decentralized euthanasia was specifically designed to hide foul play. And this was, of course, a reaction to the experiences with T4, which had to be suspended in August 1941 because the public had realized what was going on and had often reacted with fury to these revelations. So the clearest evidence for the effects of decentralized euthanasia lies in increasing mortality rates, as shown in the next slide. As a first approach, this is a purely statistic matter. And here we see that mortality peaked twice, during both World War I and World War II. And the difference between the two is that during World War II, this peak in mortality was the result of careful planning on the side of the people in charge. Patients would suffer from starvation, neglect, cold. There was also a greatly increased risk, and sometimes a willfully increased risk, of infectious diseases. In other institutions, this is different to Steinhof. For example, in Lower Austria or Carinthia, some doctors would go even further and directly kill patients with various means, including drug overdoses and electric shock. Behind these statistics, there are, of course, heartbreaking individual stories. Karl Christa, for example, he was admitted to Steinhof in 1938 because he was depressed after an extended period of unemployment. He received shock treatments with cardiazol. He was frequently agitated, confused, sleepless, and was therefore put in a caged bed, like the one you saw earlier in this photograph of the children's ward. When feeling better, he would work in a hospital workshop and garden. His health deteriorated markedly. In October 1941, for unknown reasons, he received an injection with malaria-infected blood. And over time, he also lost more and more weight, which you can see in this table on the right side. From late 1939 until his death in April 1942, the weight loss amounted to more than 17 kilograms. In all, at Steinhof alone, approximately 3,500 patients would die under these circumstances of willfully provoked or induced mass mortality. So a question that was also raised the last time, what happened to the perpetrators after the war? If today we look back at the immediate post-war years, the efforts of denazification and retribution for Nazi crimes often tend to be underestimated. Under the close supervision of the four Allied powers, immediately after the war, a remarkable machinery was set up in order to purge the Austrian administration and all areas of public and economic life from National Socialist influence. In Vienna, Michael Miller has shown this already. There was a trial held against the perpetrators at the Spiegelgrund. Ernst Illing, the successor of Herwig Czech as the Spiegelgrund's director, he was sentenced to death and hanged in 1946. Herwig Czech himself, who can be called, he's the main perpetrator in this issue in Vienna, he was arrested and tried by the Soviets and died in a Moscow prison in 1952. However, and this is equally important, the period in which anti-fascism, so to speak, was the order of the day, lasted only to about 1948. After that, the former Nazis could increasingly reestablish or regain their positions in society and reestablish their political influence. An example for how perpetrators could escape justice nearly completely is Hans Berta. He was the director of Steinhof in 1944 and 1945, which makes him the main responsible for the decentralized euthanasia that I have described, although briefly. He was never even prosecuted. In 1954, he became the chair in psychiatry at the University of Graz, and later he was even elected dean of the Graz Medical Faculty. But the best known case today is that of Heinrich Gross, the senior doctor in Pavilion 15, which was the killing pavilion of Spiegelgrund. Gross became one of the most prominent psychiatrists in Austria as an expert witness in court, but also as a neuropathologist. And as such, he built his scientific career on brain specimens that he had obtained from his victims at Spiegelgrund. This is an image of the brain collection, as Heinrich Koss' brain collection, as it was in early 2002, before it was buried at Vienna's Central Cemetery. These specimens, they served as a basis for dozens of scientific papers, beginning in the mid-1950s, right through the 1960s and 1970s. Here's a close-up of one of the classes that held these wet specimens. Heinrich Koss enjoyed a position as Austria's most prominent psychiatrist. He was often involved in high-profile court cases as an expert witness, and it took the extraordinary courage of a Spiegelgrund survivor to bring Heinrich Koss' involvement in Nazi crimes to light. The name of this survivor was Friedrich Zavrel. This is the interview that he gave while in prison for the Daily Courier in 1978, triggering for the first time a public reckoning for Heinrich Koss. And this is Friedrich Zavrel. Nearly to the day, 10 years ago, I realized this when preparing for this talk. I had the opportunity to conduct an interview with Friedrich Zavrel, which you can watch in an edited but still extensive version on the website of the Steinhof Memorial, which is indicated here, www.gedenkstätte-steinhof.at. 30 years after the war, Zavrel had a further encounter with Heinrich Koss. He had extensively known him during his time as an inmate patient, or I would say rather inmate at Spiegelgrund. So he encountered Heinrich Koss another time. And this was an extraordinary moment that I would like to present to you in Zavrel's own words in a clip that lasts about 5 minutes. I hope this is going to work.
Ein Beamter hat gesagt, Zavrel, Sie müssen zur Psychiatrierung. Zu wem komme ich denn? Habe ich gesagt, zum Dr. Heinrich Groß. Und nach 33 Jahren, oder gut 34 Jahren, bin ich ihm genauso wieder gegenüber gesessen, wie Sie jetzt da sind. Und mein erster Gedanke war, weil der war ja immer Schaftstiefel, Britscheshosen und was weiß Gott, der Ärztemantel oder Schuh dran, aber immer so ein strammer Reichsbürger. Ja. Und jetzt ist er dort gesessen und mein erster Gedanke war, Heinrich Fett bist du. Und er hat geredet. Und ich habe meiner Mutter das Ehrenwort gegeben, ich werde nie wieder über den Spiegelgrund reden. Weil ich habe 2 kleine Schwestern gekriegt und die haben von der Hitlerzeit gar nichts gewusst. Und dass nichts mehr in der Zeitung steht und so. Und dass die ruhig in die Schule gehen. Weil die Zeitungen bringen ja gleich den Namen auf der ersten Seite, auch wenn es sein muss. Und habe ich gesagt, nein, Mama, ich rede wirklich nur mit einem Spiegelgrund. Ja, und er redet und was ist Ihnen da eingefallen? Und man denkt, ist das noch oder war nicht anders war. Der ist genauso wie damals. Ich habe ihn reden lassen. Und jetzt haben wir gedacht, magst du mit ihm Schluss? Nicht, also vielleicht begreift er dich. Habe ich gesagt, glaubt mir, Herr Doktor, ich kenne Menschen, die haben hunderttausende Mal mehr verbrochen wie ich. Sind angesehene Bürger, sind in hohen Stellungen, tragen Auszeichnungen der Republik. Wer hat den Körnerpreis gekriegt und den für Wissenschaft und Kunst, weil er auf die Gehirne, wo er einen Totenschein unterschrieben hat, weitergefuselt hat. Und die haben tausende Mal mehr verbrochen. Aber da kommt kein Staatsanwalt und so. Aber bei mir, Polizei, Staatsanwalt, Richter, Psychiater, wer wird denn noch kommen? Ja, Sie dürfen doch nicht glauben, dass Sie machen dürfen, was Sie wollen. Sag ich, das weiß ich schon. Aber das wissen die anderen damals auch nicht. Die haben es auch nicht gewusst, dass sie das machen dürfen. Und haben es trotzdem gemacht. Ja, so ist es halt dann hin und her gegangen. Und dann ist es selber, das gekommen wie wenn ein Donnerwetter kommt, hat er gesagt, sind Sie schon einmal psychiatriert worden? Und da habe ich zu ihm gesagt, sage ich, Herr Doktor, für einen Akademiker haben sie so schlechtes Gedächtnis. Ich sagte, auf was soll ich mich denn erinnern können? Da war er noch so aufbrausend. Habe ich gesagt, ich hoffe, dass ich den Dr. Jekelius, den Dr. Grenek, den Dr. Illing, die Hübsch, die Türk, die Jockel und habe halt so alle aufgezählt, dass ich die nicht schon vergisst. Ja. Na, vielleicht, das kann man. Aber können Sie überhaupt noch ruhig schlafen? Haben Sie nicht gehört, die kleinen Kinder waren auf dem Balkon draußen? Haben Sie es nie gehört? Die, was umgebracht worden sind. Der so zurückgehört, der so weiß von dieser, wie der Plafond. Dann hat sie 4 Bett, der hat ausgeschaut, als wir waren noch 50 Jahre älter waren. Sie waren da oben. So was ganz hohen erkennen. Sie haben nie darüber gesprochen. So genau. Und ich wollte ja heute nicht reden. Ich habe meiner Mutter gegenüber irgendwas gebraucht. Und das ist nicht so einfach. Nun, und ja, dann ist er richtig, wie soll ich das sagen, richtig schäbig geworden. Ja, das ändert doch alles. Ja, das ist so eine ganze neue, wie sagt man da, Ausgang, nimmt das Ganze da. Und jedenfalls mit einem Wort, er hat mir sämtliche gutachterliche Hilfe versprochen, die geben kann. Und der Bettelheim war damals mein Rechtsanwalt. Und den habe ich das erzählt. Und da hat er gesagt, na dann brauche ich es mir nicht mehr. Wenn der Groß das in die Hand nimmt. Da. Und ich habe noch gesagt, sage, Herr Dr. Brems nur, ich traue ihm nicht, was er sagt. Ja. Und dann kommt, 14 Tage später, hat mir der Richter ein gutes Gutachten geschrieben, was der Heinrich Groß geschrieben hat. Ich habe zum Lesen angefangen. Ich habe mir gedacht, das kann nicht mehr Gutachten sein. Das gibt es gar nicht. Habe ich das gelesen, dann habe ich noch einmal zugemacht. Ja, Friedrich Zauberer steht da drauf. Der hat ein Gutachten geschrieben, da war ich tausendmal schlimmer als wir alle Vergaser in Auschwitz und was weiß ich, was zu sagen soll. Ja. Und ein Beamter.
So this expert opinion that Heinrich Gross wrote on Friedrich Zabel led to him being put into indefinite detention. Actually, it's an instrument that is today is in a political discussion again, because Austria is here in a very perilous territory when it comes to human rights. And it took many years for Friedrich Zabel to regain his freedom, and more than 2 decades to bring Heinrich Gross finally to court. Zabel went on to become one of the most important and well-known witnesses to the Nazi atrocities in Austria up until his death in 2015. Heinrich Gross, on his side, was put on trial in the year 2000 for murder. However, the trial did not go very far. Gross managed to convince the court that he was unable to follow the proceedings due to health reasons. Nevertheless, it can be argued that this was an important turning point in Austria's society and how it dealt with the medical crimes committed during National Socialism. In April 2002, the mortal remains of the Spiegelgrund victims, so basically the brain specimens and other specimens that you saw in the earlier picture, were laid to rest in a grave of honor at the Vienna Central Cemetery. At about the same time, the memorial for the Spiegelgrund victims in front of the theater on the premises that Michael Miller also showed earlier was erected or installed. And not least, the permanent exhibition was opened on the premises of Steinhof that documents the history of Nazi medicine in Second World War Vienna. Before the corona epidemic closed or forced the exhibition to temporarily close, about 7,000 people visited it each year, which means that the topic is not as neglected than it used to be. And with this, I give you the view of the outside pavilion. Maybe last and final remark. This is the outside view of Object V, where the permanent exhibition is housed. And I understand that according to the current development plan for the campus, this building in the future is destined to serve for student housing. And now I'm looking forward to Ina Friedmann's comments, and after that, of course, to all of your questions. And I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Herwig, for this impressive insight into the Steinhof history. You spoke about very important points, and I would like to pick up on a few of them and take them a little further. I think integrating some of these aspects into commemorative culture can widen the spectrum of remembrance. So let me start with the treatment of perpetrators after 1945. Herwig has shown in detail the legal approach to the persons mainly responsible for the crimes at Steinhof who were facing criminal prosecution, or were not, like Hans Berta and Heinrich Gross. I would like to look at something a little beyond that now, at those people who have not been confronted with legal consequences and who have remained unconsidered in historical research as well for a long time. Following initial research regarding the main perpetrators and their actions, their range of duties and responsibilities, there is now an increasing interest in those who have added just as much to the realization of persecution and murder and to its effectiveness with preliminary work on different levels. We have to bear in mind that a system of exclusion, persecution, and murder could not exist without the contribution of many individuals. And these individuals, they were not held accountable after 1945 if they were not involved directly, meaning literally with the syringe in their hands. Although there were bureaucratic procedures to purge Austrian administration and relevant posts from Nazis, as Herwig mentioned, these intentions stayed superficial. What I mean by that is that those individual contributors generally were not even categorized as NS followers or nominal members if they were not members of the Nazi party, which also illustrates that post-war politics clearly were not interested in the fundamental reorganization of an Austrian post-Nazi society in the long run. And also today, most of them, of the individual contributors to the NS system, remain anonymous unless they raise scientific attention because they became famous after 1945 in one way or another, and therefore generated public and/or scientific interest. And at this point, I would like to refer to what Herwig just explained about Hans Asperger, and also what Edith Schäffer detailed in her lecture here with CEU in February as well. They both made the point of his complicity to the NS system by transferals of children from the ward he was head of at the Vienna University Children's Clinic to Spiegelgrund. And this example does emphasize what I said about the recent research on more prominent people, of course regarding Asperger himself, but also concerning the disregard of another not so prominent doctor from the same ward, Dr. Rohracher, who also released children from the ward to Spiegelgrund, but is hardly ever mentioned by name so far and not researched into yet. So generally speaking, it can be said that the common argument of only having abided by laws and carried out orders elucidates on one hand the bureaucratic collaborative mechanisms of this system very clearly, and on the other hand, it facilitated also the self-assessment regarding the importance and the impact of one's own role. So to outline this as a whole, I would like to take the example of forced sterilizations that Herwig shortly touched on, which were determined by hereditary health courts, which were established only during National Socialist regime and should prevent people categorized as hereditarily ill from having children. Although the underlying law was abandoned in Austria in May 1945 already due to it being a Nazi law, neither the chairman of the hereditary health courts who were giving the verdicts, nor the surgeons and gynecologists who were performing the sterilizations, nor the medical experts who had given their expertise on the alleged need of the surgery, nor the persons who had initialized the trials of people's right of procreation, meaning the personnel of the state's health officers, namely physicians and welfare workers, were prosecuted unless they were members of the Nazi party. Prosecution in these cases of NS membership, however, did not contain the involvement with forced sterilization. And the victims, sadly enough, correspondingly have not been integrated into the Austrian victim welfare law up until 2005. But to come back now to the topic at hand, in an older publication, Herwig labeled the individual participants involved as providers or carriers of extermination, describing the cooperation and the connection of Spiegelgrund with the Vienna University's Children's Clinic, which he also just mentioned. This denomination illustrates the importance of collaboration within National Socialism as a whole. And this is actually my crucial point now, meaning that the executive authority could not exist without the supplying authority. So to remain with the given example, Spiegelgrund needed other institutions supplying it with children. And there were many such institutions because besides the medical ones, we come into the welfare sphere here. Aside of somatic reasons, there were also psychological and social reasons for admittance to Spiegelgrund. So following that, I want to emphasize that the view on children and adolescents within the welfare system remained unchanged for a very long time after the liberation. So also after 1945, the affected minors, like before, primarily from the lower classes, should be raised to become so-called useful members of society. And this mainly by means of the youth welfare office taking them out of their families because they allegedly were not able to raise them in a way conceived as proper, or say because of domestic violence, just to give two examples. And in the educational homes then, on the other side, the affected minors often also encountered different kinds of abuse, degradation, and violence. And as an extreme example of continuity in this context, I would like to mention the Children's Home for Boys in Wimmersdorf in Lower Austria, because it was not only continuous in the treatment of the children interned there, but also on the level of the personnel. It was opened as a vacation or convalescent home during the 1920s by a family, and the same family ran it as a children's home during the Nazi period up until 1981, and in the Second Republic as a contractual home of the city of Vienna. And in 1980, the conditions there were made public in a TV documentary, which has been the reason that the city of Vienna stopped sending boys there and for the closing in the following year. Also, the NS past of the family who ran the home became a topic then. A survivor of Spiegelgrund, Franz Bulkert, whose testimony can be watched on the website of Steinhof Memorial that Herwig already mentioned, gedenkstätte-steinhof.at, who had been interned at Spiegelgrund in December 1944, stayed until August 1945, and subsequently was sent to Wimmersdorf for 7 years, characterized the treatment, meaning the brutality and the violence in Wimmersdorf, as basically the continuation of Spiegelgrund. And I'm already coming to my last point now. Herwig mentioned the example of Friedrich Zavrel, whom we just heard talking, and his confrontations with Heinrich Gross taking place over decades, so to speak. And I think this example perfectly illustrates the long continuities regarding the perception of minors within the welfare system on one side, and the lower social classes on the other. And it also shows the resulting effects for the further lives of the ones affected by those assessments and expertise. And at the same time, it sheds light on the insufficient criminal prosecution of NS perpetrators and the reputation they had based on their professional, quite often scientific position and standing. So being in a position like Gross was, the expert had the means to define basically who should be locked up. And therefore Gross, to stay with him here, he could rely on his own already fatally documented argumentation. But what exactly do I mean with the perception of the lower classes that I just mentioned? What I'm saying is that the authority of the assessment of behavior and life designs was and remained with the socially highly recognized professions, and it remained unquestioned. And Gross's own past had not been an issue for a long period of time, while the past of Friedrich Zahrl, on the contrary, had been constantly. And it is this dichotomy that I think we should reflect on, and that should also play a role in commemorative culture in a post-National Socialist society. Because the influence of seemingly specialist expertise did not vanish with the end of the war, and it also didn't vanish within the first post-war decade. So what this generation of scientists has left us behind is still noticeable today, and I think we should also remember this and be actually very aware of this. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Herwig and Ina for grappling with this very, very difficult topic and educating us about it, and helping us also think about the legacy. And I think in Ina's remarks right now, talked about the continuities here. And also Herwig in his lecture also talked about the justice or even the lack of justice after the Second World War. I'm going to ask a few questions here to get the discussion started, but I'd like to encourage the 104 people in the audience right now to think about your questions, and if you have questions, to write them in the chat box. I think this is the best way for us to convey the questions to Herwig and Ina. And I want to start off with a question, and I want to engage the two of you in a discussion about this, about the period 1940 to 1945 within the larger picture. So what you've done today is you've looked at this a little bit in the longue durée. Herwig started in 1907 with the opening of the psychiatric hospital, and Ina, you have taken this to a large extent up until today, and we also heard the words of one of the survivors from only about 10, 15 years ago. And I would like you to talk about maybe the legacy of 1907 already. So you've really focused on the period of 1940 to 1945 and the crimes that took place there. But to what extent did the psychiatric hospital, as it was established in 1907, and its activities during the First Republic, to what extent did this influence what happened? And again, also the supply chains that were set up. One of the things that Ina talked about, the supply chains of children, essentially. And what are also the legacies in the post-war period? So if we look at this past 1945, you both talked about this in terms of bringing the perpetrators to justice or not bringing them to justice. But what about in terms of the impact on psychiatry and psychiatric hospitals in Austria? One of the things that struck me when I was looking for a photograph of Pavilion 15, which I wasn't actually able to find a good photo of, is that I found photos of the Otto Wagner Hospital, or the Baumgartner Höhe, from the 1970s and 80s, with pictures of patients in caged beds. So Herwig started his lecture with a picture of a caged bed, and these caged beds were still being used in the 1970s and 80s. So maybe you could talk about the continuities within psychiatry as well, and to what extent Steinhof was an aberration, or to what extent this was maybe part of a larger picture. Maybe Herwig, if you could respond first.
Okay, many thanks. You're opening big questions here. So the legacy of 1907. but one thing we can say about the history of Steinhof is that it was very well intentioned, but that it was overcrowded nearly from the beginning. So there's a constant factor in the history of this institution is that it was occupied by many more patients, or it had to care for many more patients than was originally intended, and that this is a structural factor that accompanies it probably into the 80s or so. For the people in the audience who can answer this more precisely, who have some experience in the psychiatric field, but basically up to the deinstitutionalization that also came late in Vienna, about 20 years after other countries. Overcrowding, or simply a hospital that had to run way over its capacity, was a structural factor. Linked to this, patients in psychiatric care were always underfunded, about half of what normal somatic patients would get. So this is simply the rate that the authorities considered necessary to keep a patient alive, to feed them, to house them. There's a structural discrimination against psychiatric patients in institutional care that spans the century in which Steinhof was in operation. So I showed you these two peaks of mortality: First World War, Second World War. So we have already a catastrophe of hunger and malnourishment and cold and neglect in the First World War that repeats itself in the second. This is not limited to Steinhof. There are publications by Wagner von Jauregg, for example. You see this all over Europe, that psychiatric patients are a very vulnerable population as such. And in times of crisis, most of them are in these institutions against their will. This is also a constant from the beginning. Very few are there by choice. And the moment things get more difficult, they have it very hard to, for example, to get extra supplies of food, etc. If they don't have relatives who care for them, they can easily get into a vortex of decline and of destruction. Let's put it this way. So if we link this directly to the T4, for example, what we can say is that in T4, the proportion of patients that were killed in Austria compared to Germany is about double. It's twice as high. And there are different factors that could explain this. One is that T4 had, of course, a certain succession. It moved from one province to the others, and it was suspended. So it was not carried through right to the end. But still, it's remarkable that in Austria, you have institutions that lose up to 90% of their patients. The most extreme example is in an ex-territory, southern Styria. So this is now part of Slovenia, Novochelnya. 90% of patients were deported. In Steinhof, it's 2/3. And this is extraordinary. And this is a structural factor also of psychiatric care in Austria, as well intentioned as it was to build a city for the insane at the outskirts of Vienna. It also meant that they were concentrated already. They were already a sitting target when this program of extermination was implemented. And so these very large structures, it's not only Steinhof, this is Feldhof in Graz, this is the Walduna in Vorarlberg, it's Niedernhart, Maueröhling, Gucking, etc., etc. Institutions with thousands of patients, with a handful of doctors and, of course, more staff that was caring for them, but still very anonymous places. And these are really catastrophes waiting to happen, so to speak. Another line of continuity, and give me a sign if I should,
Yeah. After this line, then we'll ask Ina to maybe.
Okay. When it comes to supply chains, of course, this system of youth welfare, so-called youth welfare, was built in Vienna in the interwar period. So the Kinderübernahmestelle, for example, that provided most of Spiegelgrund victims, was founded by Julius Tandler in the interwar period. Again, with the best of intentions, Red Vienna, there was an element of eugenic thinking, but I think nobody would really argue that the authorities should have left children in the hands of parents who abused them, who starved them, who neglected them. But again, a propensity towards institutional care, that's also a factor that starts in the interwar period, overspans the Second World War, and has consequences way beyond and up to very recent times. And if we look more specifically at the place and continuities, Pavilion 15, for example, yes, Pavilion 15 was a home for children with severe disabilities, and there were terrible conditions of neglect up also quite recently. There was even a certain time, I would say, we neglected to look at these continuities. We looked at the perpetrators and what they did after 45, but there was less work done really on the institutional histories of these specific institutions. And this means that ultimately conditions in the 50s, 60s, 70s sometimes were probably not that far removed from what happened at Spiegelgrund, minus the killing apparatus, of course. And with this, thank you.
Thank
you. I want to jump in at the definition of neglect. Herwig, you just mentioned the interwar period and youth welfare that was founded in Vienna, and the good intentions that actually were there. And also, like you said, and that's the reason why I brought the example of the youth welfare office taking children out of families because of domestic violence, because obviously you wouldn't want to have children living with violent family members. But if children are taken out of the families, then it has to be made sure that they are not further confronted with violence in the new surrounding they are brought into. And that's the point that where I see the problem with Austrian welfare for a long period of time. And also the families that the youth welfare office or the welfare workers were focusing on, it was often or mainly poor families. It was marginalized families, and it was especially often single mothers who had to work and therefore couldn't watch their children in a way that was perceived as appropriate. So instead of finding ways of supporting families, the system failed those families and brought children into other systems, into homes, where they were raised in structures that were just violent and didn't provide them with any education or any individual care. And that already happened in the interwar period. It was, of course, worse during National Socialism, because the possibilities to treat the children that were seen as not fitting in, as abnormal, or as somehow asocial, for example, as it was called too, they could be basically murdered now. But in the post-war years, and this brings me to the picture of the caged beds in the 1970s and 80s, the possibilities to treat those children, of course, changed again. It was not possible to kill them anymore, but still the treatment and the institutions stayed the same, and the view on the children stayed the same. And this is something that I think I would really emphasize, because there was no change in thought, and there was no change in the education of welfare workers, for example, or all the professional fields that were dealing with the children in trouble. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned definitions, so the definition of neglect. And we have a couple of questions from Judith Chandor about definitions. And the two words that she brings up are euthanasia and hereditary conditions. Okay, and these are terms that were distorted and perhaps misused and abused in the period that we're looking at. And what are the consequences of this? So one example is euthanasia. When we talk about euthanasia today, as Judith points out, this is used for, it's used in a very different sense today. We don't use the term for non-voluntary killing. We use this for a choice to end one's life, a voluntary choice to end one's life. And how is the term euthanasia actually used So we're looking at a period when this is the Nazi terminology, which is, I mean, if we look at Klemper or some others, we look at the way that the Nazis distorted this language. So what impact does this have on the way this term is used today? We still talk about child euthanasia, even though this is not child euthanasia as we understand it today. And the other example that you gave is hereditary disease or hereditary condition. And the example that was given just now was a child who had an accident and suffered paralysis. So this is by no means a hereditary illness, but it was treated in the same way that hereditary illnesses were treated. So what can we learn about terminology here, definitions, and how they are used and abused, and what can we take from this?
Yeah, as you rightly point out, the term euthanasia is a very complex one with a complex history. It has somehow established itself, or has been established as a historical term for what happened during National Socialism. I personally never use it without some kind of specifying what I'm referring to. Either, I mean, there's scare quotes, Nazi euthanasia killing program. For me, it's more a question of style when I write or talk. Sometimes you need synonyms, etc. I would never use it, without this form of qualifiers and exclusively. And of course, I talk about extermination, killing. It's important to address things by appropriate and precise terms. However, I wouldn't go as far as completely banning the use of the term in context with Nazi euthanasia on the grounds that today this is something completely different and there's really no possibility of, how should I put it, there's no common ground between the two terms, because modern bioethics also distances itself from this term. It's not used anymore. It's living somewhere in between, so to speak. And ultimately, it means a good death. And this is what the Nazis claimed. So it's a euphemism, very much on the same level as a final solution, etc., which can be used because they are common signifiers, but they have to be used with care. But hereditary conditions, I mean, one thing that's important to point out, T4, for example, had very little to do with hereditary conditions. This is a misunderstanding. Of course, race hygiene, eugenics very much talked about real or alleged hereditary conditions, but ultimately in T4, what counted was the prognosis. So if someone could be expected to perform productive work in the future or not, it was really much more about productivity than heredity.
Ina, do you have something to add?
Yes, adding to that, because the hereditary diseases and the definitions, that was very important when it came to forced sterilizations, because there the so-called hereditary conditions or diseases, they were strictly defined. So the people who should be affected were a strictly defined group, as it seems. There was one exception, and that was a so-called congenital imbecility, because all the other conditions were somatic, and this was the one where it was possible. It gave the possibility for doctors, for the involved persons, to also take in the persons that were behaving in a way that was seen as inappropriate, who were called asocial, because people called asocial should actually not be sterilized. But this was a way to still integrate them in the local situations. So I think the definition, even if it is strict and very narrow, there is always a way to sneak around it or to find an extra way in there.
Okay, thank you. And one of the comments we have from Sami Teicher, who again I mentioned worked with some of the survivors of Spiegelgrund and Steinhof. He talks about the continuities here in terms of sterilization. This was not something that was limited to the period from 1940 to 1945 or limited to Steinhof, and points out that children with genetic disorders like trisomy were sterilized on a regular basis. Children of Roma descent were still taken away from their parents and put in an institution in the 70s, and it took until the 70s for Steinhof to get the same position as other hospitals in this respect. There are a number of questions about what I might call the Austrian specificity of the post-war period. You've outlined the large network that included Schloss Hartheim, included Gugging, included Steinhof, and a number of other institutions in the Ostmark, which was the Nazi term for Austria. And this was a large network. You describe it as a supply chain. But what's interesting is that in the post-war period, in Austria, I think less so than in Germany, this was not really grappled with. So the grappling with the Nazi past, of course, in Austria came a generation later than it did in Germany, we could say. But how do you explain why this is the question asked by Rob, I can't see the last name here, but could you offer any explanation as to why the execution of justice was so limited? And is there some specificity to the Austrian case if we compare it to post-war Germany or elsewhere?
So the Austrian specificity, I'm sometimes tempted to think that there's a little tendency to overestimate the judicial prosecution of Nazi crimes in Germany. So cases like Heinrich Gross or Hans Berta, you will also find them in Germany. And if you read even Ernst Klee's work, who started this in the 80s, you will find one perpetrator after the other who somehow managed to escape. One example would be Georg Renner, for example, who was the head physician of Hartheim, who literally turned on the gas and who operated the gas chamber, who also escaped justice in federal Germany in the late 1960s. So this is one important caveat. You cannot just assume that Germany went through with its denazification program. In the field of medicine, it is a very mixed picture, and then many perpetrators escaped. The reasons for this are complex. In Austria, you have the geopolitical situation. Basically, the Allied powers, for a few years, they really put pressure on Austrian authorities to go through with denazification. We had one specificity compared to Germany, that there was a special court system installed, the Volksgerichte, that operated between 1945 and 1955. So a lot of these cases, they were tried by Austrian courts. And here we simply see that in 45, 46, they mean well. Illing gets condemned to death. And this will to prosecute, so to speak, erodes very fast. Within 2, 3, 4 years, cases end nowhere, cases are dropped, persecutions are dropped, convictions are overturned, or if someone has already been convicted and maybe is in prison, there will be early releases. The classic approach is the Christmas amnesty that was a good imperial tradition signed off by the federal president. So he could every year release thousands of Nazis. And the main political reason for this was, of course, that there was a kind of gridlock between the left and the right. And the Nazis, former Nazis, reformed Nazis, or unreformed Nazis, they were the most important reservoir of votes. And in some cases, like also the Social Democratic Party, not just of votes, but also of operatives, functionaries, party members. The one reservoir that was to be had, so to speak. Austria was characterized for a very long time by very stable political affiliation, and so it was very hard. You couldn't convince someone from the other side to change sides. This was the so-called Dritte Lager, the third camp, the pan-German nationalist pro-Nazi camp, where you had the best chance to gain this edge to actually take power in Austria. And this is why all the parties, to two big parties, remaining democratic parties, vied for these votes of the former Nazis.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask a question now from Michael Ignatieff. You mentioned in the talk that in 1941, T4 was actually suspended. And he says that there was a demonstration in front of Steinhof opposing what was happening to the children. Can you describe what happened and who was responsible for the protest at Steinhof against T4?
Yeah, this is actually quite extraordinary. There are not many accounts of organized public protest in Nazi Germany. And these are protests that are well described. We have the transcripts of Erwin Ekelius' interrogatory in the Soviet Union, but also a letter that dates from the same period, so it's a very reliable source. And basically, it seems that it was mostly relatives of people who had been deported or were to be deported who protested in front of Steinhof. There was some kind of meeting in a nearby hotel and a public protest. And this was broken up by the police, but the protesters, they were treated with caution because there were even Nazi party members among them. So this was not clearly anti-Nazi protest, but it was directed against these deportations and against the killing of close relatives.
Okay, thank you. Paul Weindling has asked, how do you account for the fact that the Kinderfachabteilung of all the children institutions here, children hospitals at Spiegelgrund had the highest number of killings of children, and that uniquely neuropathological research took place in the same location? So again, and this is part of another set of questions here. To what extent is Steinhof the most egregious offender here? What is distinct about Steinhof compared to the other institutions in this larger network that we're looking at? Maybe Ina or Herwig.
Well, these are very good questions. Thank you, Paul. I'm not sure I have a satisfactory answer to either of them. Spiegelgrund was founded in 1940. We know it was one of the biggest of these institutions in Germany. Overall, we had over 30 so-called special children's departments or Kinderfachabteilungen. Many of those were much more limited in scope. There were a few dedicated beds within an existing hospital, like in Feldhof in Graz, and one or more physicians, doctors who were sworn to secrecy and were dedicated themselves to this work, the so-called Reichsausschuss work within this child euthanasia program. In Vienna, it was a new institution. I think it has to do with the fact, first of all, Vienna was one of the largest cities in the Reich after the annexation. It was considered a city with a very problematic population, a lot of racial mixing. It was an outpost of the German Reich and of the it was considered an exposed outpost, so to speak. There was a very large Czech population, for example, where the politicians and this race hygienists were not very clear what to do about it. So it's possible that it has something with a sense of urgency that in Vienna, which also, of course, came into the Reich late, extraordinary measures had to be taken in this respect. But I don't have one, piece of evidence I could point to found this. I just think it makes sense in the overall context. It also makes sense if you see that, for example, this biological index card system that was established, they also overtook within 2 years the rest of the Reich or other regions. There were over 700,000 people registered in these files. And so in various fields, also, of course, in the anti-Jewish policies, we see that within a short period of time in Vienna, a kind of radicalization took place that went beyond what we saw in the Reich. And I think it is plausible to assume that Spiegelgrund is part of this. The second question, when it comes to research, on the one hand, I said research interests were intertwined with the child euthanasia program. So there was some central planning going on when some coordination. And for example, the research of so-called feeble-mindedness and the hereditary aspect or character of feeble-mindedness was a dedicated research question within the system. And on the other hand, we have individual interests. So it was physicians who pushed this. But in the case of Vienna, it's not clear to me, because Ikelius had no interest in neuropathology, and after all, he was in control of the system until 1942. Illing was much more of a researcher and a neuropathologist. He came from Brandenburg. He was also he got his habilitation. So he had a clear research interest, and then he could have been the one driving this, behind this. He also published on the Spiegelgrund victims during the war. I think again, it's a constellation of factors.
Okay. I want to remind everybody here that the lecture series is in part to help us think about our role and responsibility as we move to Steinhof in 4 years. And the visioning group is really tasked with this responsibility of really thinking about what CEU, an American accredited and also Hungarian and Austrian accredited, but a foreign university coming to Vienna, moving to a very, very sensitive spot on the outskirts of Vienna. What are our responsibilities? What are the opportunities that this move presents us with? And Ina, you talked a lot about commemorative culture. So maybe Ina and Herwig, you have some reflections on this. What really we as CEU should be doing, aside from organizing these kinds of lecture series. What are the real tangible things that you think that we should be doing?
Well, first of all, whatever you decide for, I would say that I think it's very important to really integrate how the legacy of National Socialism was conserved and on how many levels it affected the society in the decades following 1945. So I think to find a way to show how affected Austria as a whole, I would say, was and didn't recover, because there were so many strings and levels that we just touched on here that came together and formed this post-war society. So it only was possible to start to really deal with a lot of aspects very late, and to become aware of how long, for example, ideological concepts or also scientific theories survived and were conserved up until maybe the 80s or even longer, some of them. And I think integrating this long aftermath or history of the aftermath would be very important in any kind of commemorating culture. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And Herwig, maybe you have some reflections on this that you could share with us.
Well, on the one hand, I fully agree with Ina. I also find it very well put by President Ignatieff, who the last time said that the CEU will consider itself the kind of custodian of this path. And I think this is really probably the founding principle of any approach. I think there are many levels on which such a commemoration can take place in terms of teaching, of research. After all, this is what university does. And more specifically, I think it would also be very important to have some kind of continuity or successor to the existing exhibition memorial, so that there's also an outward face to the public. And of course, a big issue that was discussed last time, that Paul Weindling also brought into the debate, is the naming of the victims. We know the names of the Spiegelgrund victims. These have been documented nearly 20 years ago now. The other victims can be known. It's not a problem of documentation. It's really mostly a problem of doing this work and documenting it. And so, yeah, I think this is also one way to go forward.
we unfortunately are out of time. We're only scheduled until 7:30 right now. And I would just want to say a couple things. One is that there were a couple questions about Asperger's work at Steinhof. And in the chat, I've shared an article by Herwig Czech dealing with Hans Asperger, National Socialism, race, hygiene in Nazi-era Vienna, where he documents the activities very well. So that article is available on chat for everybody to look at. I also want to announce that we have a lecture coming up on May 5th by Leslie Topp. Everybody who got this invitation will also get that invitation. And this is, she's an architectural historian in the UK, and she'll be looking at Steinhof starting in 1907 from, of course, the history of the architecture of psychiatry perspective as well. So we've been focusing in the last two lectures very much on the period from 1940 to 1945, on the period of the child murder and child experimentation. But we're going to be looking at this also in a much longer durée, going back to the intersection of architecture and psychiatric care and psychiatric thought in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. I want to thank Herwig Czech and Ina Friedmann for sharing their knowledge with us. And I want to thank Herwig also for having personal discussions before this about what we should do as a visioning committee. And I look forward to having additional conversations at the next lectures that we organize, but also over the next couple of years as the visioning committee puts together its proposal for what CEU is going to be doing at Steinhof, but also as we start implementing this over the next couple of years as we prepare for our move to Steinhof. So thank you, everybody, and we will keep you posted about the future developments.